Hey, what's going on? This is VideoFort Don and I am back with another tutorial today, and we're going to be looking at how to build a holographic map animation in Cinema 4D and After Effects. And this is going to be quite a long tutorial. There are quite a few topics which I haven't covered before, and so below the video there will be a list with some timestamps so you can see what each section is going to be talking about, so check that out below. Anyway, since there is so much to go through in this one, let's just jump into Cinema 4D now and start building our scene. So the first thing we'll make is the buildings, and this is the geometry and also the shading style. So in Cinema 4D, this is the starting point, and you might be wondering, what is this exactly? It's some models which I prepared for this tutorial, so you'll be able to download these if you want to follow along with exactly what I am doing. And let me show you where I got these from. There is a website called 3D Warehouse, and you can download various architectural models and convert them in Cinema 4D so you can use them. So at the end of this video, I will show you the process for doing this very quickly. It's actually quite simple, and all I did once I was in Cinema 4D, I took everything, and if I just put these into a cloner and set the mode to grid, so something like this here, and I will put the count up to 4x4 because I think there are 17 of these, so you should see at least 16, and set the mode to per step, so I can just type in the size of each block. In this case it's 400, because after I converted each model from Google Sketchup, I made them all to fit within the same size rectangle. So you can see these borders here. Each model will fit within this 400 by 400 centimeter rectangle, and this just made it easier to be able to arrange them in blocks using a grid array pattern in the cloner. Okay, so that's how I did that. And like I said, you will be able to download these if you want to use the same models I am using. But you can also use the techniques you're going to watch in this tutorial with any other type of model. And perhaps you already have your own better city models or building models. From here on, you can apply the same techniques. Okay, the first step to this is to just arrange the buildings in some kind of pattern. You want to go to the clones and change this from iterate to random, so that you have the seed value, which allows you to change the distribution if you don't like what you see the first time. And then you just want to make copies and spread them around your scene. So if I do something like this, perhaps we can maybe add more grids and just do something which will look like some kind of map arrangement. Okay, and this is my arrangement here. You can be a bit more elaborate with yours. So the next step is the material you see on the buildings, this holographic looking kind of material. There are two levels to this. The first is the transparent holographic style, shading the main part of the building. And then you also have an outline effect. So let's do both of those. If I take all of the buildings and put them into a null, just to keep things organized, we can call this buildings. And then I will create a new material, and in this one we'll just turn on luminance and switch off color. And this is the color I was using before, hue 185, saturation and brightness all the way up to 100%. And let's just apply this to the null, so it goes onto all of the buildings. You see that there is this effect where they fade in from the bottom like this here, so we want to do the same. go to the alpha channel, and in the texture we will load up a gradient, but it needs to be a 3D gradient, so it fades in from the lower section and goes to the top. So if I change the type from 2D V to 3D linear, because we're going up and down, this needs to be changed in the Y values here, because we have X, Y, and Z. Let's zero out the X, and for the Y, in the start value I will go for 400, and this is based on the tallest building in the scene. So whatever that is, that's what this needs to be. If you don't know, click on your null and go to the coordinates down here, and under size you want to change this to size plus, so it displays the actual size to you. In this case it's 329 in Y, so I know the tallest building in the scene is 329 centimeters, so that will be within this range which I have defined here from 0 to 400. Except for the end control here, I just want to lower this slightly below the floor, because if I don't and just render this, and by the way this is upside down, so let's just reverse the gradient, invert the knots, and now if I render, you can see the buildings fade up from the bottom. You can see over here we have a building which has a solid fill on the base, and that's because we just need to drop this below the floor slightly. So put the end control to about -10, and this should clear things up. So that's the first step to this effect, and you can play with the gradient and just fine-tune it a bit more. If you want more color at the top, you just push the white this way, and it will introduce more color and make it more opaque at the very top. In this case, I actually want to open up the top slightly on the tallest buildings, so I will inject some black into the gradient and keep moving this until some of the buildings lose their shading at the very top. So you might have to keep going and see what you can come up with, and it's just starting to fade there. Let's bring it up, and just a bit more exaggerated there. Okay, so you might lose some of the shape from the tallest buildings, but if we combine this with the outline effect, everything will still look pretty good. So if I take everything and instance it, so to the array icon, get the instance, with the buildings selected, it will automatically populate the instance object. Yeah, if it doesn't, you can just drag this here anyway. And this will just create a copy of everything in the scene. And this copy, I want to get the atom array effect and put this in here. And then this creates some geometry based on the buildings we are using. So on the edges, we have a cylinder, and on the corners, we have a sphere. So just set these to the same size. In this case, I will go for 1 and 1, but your scale of your scene might be different, so just adjust accordingly. If you want a thicker radius, you can just bump both of these up to like 2 maybe. Okay, and to these I would just apply the same material, or I would just make a copy and apply that to the atom array. So now when I render, we also have an outline effect. Okay, one final thing I might do is just to enable transparency on the first material, but only set it to about 40 or so it's not too powerful. And this would just make everything a bit more see-through. So there are a few more elements in the scene, of course. Let's just go through these one by one. We can start with the reflective floor. This was very simple. I just took a disk, made it very large, in this case 10,000 centimeters, and just apply a reflective material to this. So if I make this black, go to reflectance, let's remove specular and add a reflection legacy layer and additive, but lower this to about 20%, and I think that might be too strong even. Apply that to the floor, and we get this. except I don't want the atom array to show up in the reflections of the floor, just the main buildings. So I will put a compositing tag onto this, and in the tag tab I will turn off seen by reflection, so only the main buildings will show up there. And actually it looks like it might be refraction, not reflection, so just untick both, and there we go. The other thing is the dotted floor effect. This is actually a texture which I generated using a free app called JSplacement. So if you open this app, the pattern type at the end there, you can create these dots or light effect. So you can play with this and see what you can come up with. And the draw chance, you know, if you push this up, we have more dots, and if you drop it, there are less. So create your map and save this somewhere where you will remember. Then I just create a new material, turn on luminance, and go to alpha again, and just load up the dot grid pattern. This is an image alpha, so I don't know why it's not working. Let's untick this. Okay, for some reason you need to just do that too, and apply this to another floor. So I will take the first disk, call this floor reflection, and make a copy and call this one floor dots. Take the reflection one and just drop it below the surface, let's say -10 on the y-axis, and if I quickly render, we should see the dots. They're just tiled too large right now, so if I go to this texture, I will change the tiling to about 8 by 8, and now we have the dots across the scene. Let's make these markers here next, the blue with the white tip. So this is some very easy geometry. I will get a cube. If I isolate this, let's go and put the X and Z sides to 1, set the Y size to 400, which again, I just need some of these to be taller than some of the buildings. And the Y position will be 200, so this sits above the floor. And then we can get a sphere, make it smaller, let's say 10 for the radius, and move that to 400. So it sits at the top there, and I can take a null, put this in here and call this single marker and solo. And let's create 2 quick materials. One will just be white. This will be for the sphere, and then if I make a copy and change this to blue, so for the cube. Okay, so we have 1 marker. We need to clone it a bunch of times. So get a cloner, go to object and set the mode to object. And the object is going to be our floor. So the one with the dots, let's use that one because it is level with the floor. And change the distribution from vertex to surface and untick align clone. So these will still be standing up. And we just need a whole lot more. So let's say 200 in this case. But they're all the same size, so let's randomize that. If I go to more graph effector and random, I will not change the position, but let's change the scale, and I will set the uniform scale to be on and set scale to 1. So some of these will now just become way too tall, and some of them might be too small. So we need to adjust the minimum and max effect of the effector, because right now it can be up to 100% larger than the original size or 100% smaller. So we want to eliminate the largest possible size, just drop the maximum here to 0, which means nothing will go above the original size of 400. And then for the minimum, we don't want them to completely disappear, so let's bring this up to about minus 50%. So the smallest marker will be 200 centimeters tall, and the tallest is still only just 400. A quick render and we get something like this here. I don't want these to appear in their reflections, and it looks like I have stretched my floor texture there, so let's just double check. And it looks like tile V was not set to 8 as well. And on the markers clone, I would just add a compositing tag and turn off scene by reflection and refraction, just to clean up the render a bit. Let's make the waypoint animations next. These you see moving throughout the scene. So for this I will need to draw some splines. And I'm gonna go into the top view. I would try and do it similar to the example. So I had the first one coming from over here and kind of turning into the center part of the map. So it looks like I might have to just move one of the cloners, this one over here. So I'm not sure which one that is. So let's move it this way a touch and maybe only have 3 blocks. Okay, it just gives me a bit more space to work with. Get the pen tool and just draw something like this here. It starts off on the right side and kind of turns in and then turns up again and goes to the center. Press escape to break the spline and just make sure these are straight. So in point mode on the spline, select the 2 points which should be straight and zero out the Z size. In the other direction, it's the X size. Just move it closer to be more in the center of these 2 sections. And I think that's fine for the first one. We can click away from this spline so we can start drawing another one separately. This is just going to be coming down from over here maybe and going to about there. It's not straight, so let's quickly zero that out. Something like that, and the final one will be coming down from over here somewhere. So let's just it's going to be a straight line, but maybe start it off to the right as well and bring it down to about that point. And I drew that on the same second spline, so let me click away first before I do this. So 1, 2, and 3. Okay, if you had a more elaborate scene, you might maybe have roads or something, in which case you would put your markers over them, perhaps. But if I go back to the perspective view, we can't really see what's going on here, so let's solo these out. And I'm gonna take a circle, set the radius to just 1, and get a sweep NURBS. And this is what I'm gonna use to generate the geometry here. So if I drop this end number 1 into the sweep, now we can generate some actual geometry. Let's duplicate this 2 more times. So this is 1, 2, and 3, and just replace the spline which is on the inside, just like that. Okay, and these will be animated to grow. So if I set my timeline to about 10 seconds, I will animate the end growth. So in my example, I started at 65%. Go to the end of the animation and go to 100. So if I play this through, the splines are just growing like this here. I think they need to be wider. So let's get the circles and set the radius to about 3. And we need the marker at the very end of each spline there. And also, if I go to timeline, this should be linear. So if I select all of these, and let's minimize this so it's not so large, but take all of these keyframes and just tick linear so we have some constant motion. And then for the marker part, I'm going to take a rectangle, 50 by 50 for the size, and also another small circle. So I'll just copy one out of here, set the radius to just 2 this time, and again take a sweep NURBS and put this into here. And then I will take a plane, width and height to 25 by 25 and orientation to Z plus, so it's facing the same direction. This can be put into a null together, and let's call this marker number 1. And for this we'll create some new materials. So again, a basic white one for the center, and then a blue one for the outside outline, and turn off the color to make sure this works. So just this right here, and this can be applied to the trail as well. This needs to be attached to the end of each spline, and we can use the align to spline tag for that. So if I go to the marker, C4D tags, and align to spline, we can drag the first one into here. It's going to attach way over here at the end. So let's quickly animate this to start at 65% as well. You can see it's in a different location, so let's we'll get back to that shortly. But if I keyframe this, go to the end, I will then keyframe at 100%, and we need this 3 times, so I will make a copy. This is number 2, and just swap out the spline in the spline path. So that's over there, and the third one will be the same thing, just with the third spline. Okay, so you see how it's not, you know, attached to the end necessarily. Sometimes it's ahead and sometimes it's behind. It's to do with the way the splines are being subdivided. So let's change the intermediate points from adaptive to uniform, and it's gonna have the same type of subdivisions, so it will now be in the correct place. But you see there aren't enough subdivisions, so the corners here don't bend around correctly. So let's change the number from 8 to, let's say, 50. And I'm also going to round off these corners. So in point mode, with all of them selected, press Ctrl A to select the corners, right click and chamfer. And if I just click and drag, it will start to round off the corners. So we want to go for about 50. And then one more thing is, if we go to the timeline, let's make this linear as well. So just select everything and press linear to make sure that they all move at the same constant speed. Let's bring back everything, and I want to take all of the markers and place them above the floor plane. So if I create a null, we can drop all of them into this, and set the coordinate position to be 50, just so they are higher than everything in the scene. And a quick render, and you see they appear in the reflection, which is fine. I think that's what I have here, just a subtle reflection, although I think they might just be too wide. So let's go to the original circle here and drop it to 2. And I think that will be a bit better, maybe even 1. Also, these markers should be looking at the camera all of the time. So if I just quickly solo them and get the markers, I will go to C4D tags and look at camera. That way, no matter where you are, they will always be facing you. Alright, the last element we will make in Cinema 4D are these random numbers you see just flickering through the scene. And we're going to have to do some Xpresso for this to work. So let me show you how we can set this up. If I just start by soloing the floor with the dots, so we can use that as a reference to clone the numbers onto, I will get a text spline and let's attach an Xpresso tag onto this. This will open up the Xpresso window. We need some custom data for our number because we can't just type that into the text here. The effect would not work, and now you will see why as we go through. And on the Xpresso tag, I'm going to add some custom user data. So if I go to the user data button, let's add some data, and we want to just call this number and set the unit type from % to real. And the step here means how many decimal places we have after each number. In the example, you see we have 3 decimal points next to every single number, so we need to set the step to 0.001, which means all of our numbers will always have 3 decimal points. So if you wanted 2, you would go for 0.01 instead. So you get the idea. So 0.01 in this case, and I will click OK. Then I will drag this into the Xpresso window. So the Xpresso tag with this custom data we've created, bring that into the Xpresso window like this, and also bring our text into this. So now I can connect the custom data to overwrite what the text is displaying. So if I link this, go to object properties and control the text value, it's going to default to 0 because that's what we have typed up right now in our data. Let's type out 100 as an example, and you see the text will automatically change to that. Now for our decimal places, we can just create a new math node, Xpresso calculate and math, and in here we want to feed this original number as input number 1, and input number 2 is going to be 0.001, and we can break this current link we have and feed that into the text. So what's happening here, it takes whatever number we type in the original box, and then it just adds 0.001 so that our decimal point will now display. Okay, so we can call this the minimum value and make a copy and call this one maximum. The idea is to blend the numbers in between using a cloner. So if I go to the max control, let's set the number here on the Xpresso custom data to be 200. So we have 2 different values now. I can just make these smaller, let's say about 30. And if I take a cloner, and they've disappeared for some reason. Okay, I dropped the size too much. Let's say 30 again. And if I take a cloner, I can take both of these and put them into here. And this is the cool part. If I change the mode from linear to object and use the same floor that we used for the marker points, you can see it attaches to the vertex points by default. So let's change that to surface, untick align clone, and now we have the numbers across the surface of this. Let's have 100 of these, and I'm gonna move them to be 400. Maybe a bit higher, let's say 410 on the y-axis. So this needs to be in the transform tab for this to work. And there we go. Currently it's just displaying the 2 different numbers over and over, but we can go to the cloner and change the clones mode from iterate to blend, and this is going to blend in between the 2 numbers that we set. So now we have the randomly generated values displaying. So then what we need to do in order for these to flicker is just animate the minimum and max values. So to begin with, on the minimum I will start at 100, go to the end and maybe just set this to 200. On the max, we will start at 200, go to the end and maybe end at about 600 or so. The higher you make the change, the faster the numbers will be flickering through. But now if I go to timeline and just linearize these keyframes as well and play through, you will see the numbers flickering and changing on each frame. Now this is quite intensive on your CPU, so don't expect some smooth playback, but you can still move around quite freely. You just won't get a decent playback rate in your viewport anymore. But whilst you're just previewing the scene, you can turn this whole thing off and just turn it on when you are ready to render. Okay, and to generate the actual geometry, because right now you can't see anything when you render, we can get an extrude. Let's drop the cloner into this and tick hierarchical so that it will extrude everything. And let's set the movement just to 0 because we need these to be flat 2D layers like so. And let's create a material for this, just a basic white luminance material, and apply it to the extrude. Okay, so if we bring back everything else, I will just put a compositing tag onto this and untick by reflection and refraction again, because I don't want that to show up. And that would be it as far as creating the elements you see in the scene. We have the grid lines. They were added in After Effects, so we'll get to that. Back in Cinema 4D, I'm just gonna create a camera and make the focal length 100 millimeters, not 1000. That's too high, because I just want to look down at this, and using a higher focal length will create a more isometric kind of viewing angle. So this will be my final angle in the camera animation. I will take a null and put the camera into here, and then I can just use the null to animate rotating around the scene like this. So starting at about maybe 60 degrees backwards, I will set this to about -40. I think 60 might be too strong. Let's say -30, set a keyframe here, go to the end, and just move it back to the original position. So 0 this out. And that's it, just a very basic animation circling around the scene. It's not going to play back until I disable the numbers. And it looks like I have to turn off the cloner itself. And now it will play back. Okay, that's fine. I can just go to the timeline. And let's make these linear too. So selecting everything just linear, the camera is in there somewhere, and playback, and we have something like this. I think I am at a higher angle than my example, about 28 degrees. In the original I was only about 20, so we can lower this and again just try and look at the final position, and you can change where the camera is looking, and the null, which is doing the actual animation, will still work fine. And you can make it faster or slower depending on what you want for your scene, but I think this is fine just as a sample. Before we output this to render, I'm gonna just try and make some adjustment to my holographic material here. I don't think it's quite like what we are looking at here. And I think one of the main differences I have is just some extra shading inside of the luminance. So if I go to luminance, I will add a Fresnel shader to this. So if I just turn this on, and this will be reversed to have an outer darker edge, and I'm just going to multiply this on top of the original color, and this should produce something which looks a bit different. So if I press Alt and R, you should see a change if I were to turn this on and off. So this is it currently in my interactive render region, which I've put the quality slider all the way up to the top. I can clear this Fresnel and you will see it's going to create something quite a bit different. So turning this on with the black enabled on the left side, it just creates a darker shade in some of the parts of the building and outlines their shape a bit better. So that's how I got this style you're looking at here. And one more thing I could try is perhaps increasing the brightness of the whole thing. Let's say 200 in the luminance, but I think that might just be too strong. In this case, I would have to go to transparency and increase that too. So maybe around 80, and just trying to balance everything in the scene. But just wanted to show you that extra step where you can use the Fresnel to generate something that looks a bit different. I think 200% is just too bright. Maybe around 150 might be acceptable. And I think that's a bit closer to the example you saw at the beginning of the video. Anyway, there's quite a lot you can do with this. Between the luminance, transparency, and alpha channel, you can really try and fine-tune the style of your scene. Another thing which I nearly forgot is the numbers here need to be facing the camera all of the time. And it's something which I've had some issues with, but if you mess around, you can get it to work. I have isolated the extrude here with the numbers and the camera and, you know, the disk we are cloning these onto. I will go to the minimum and max, and you see right now that they just face the same direction. But I can go to these two splines, go to C4D tags and look at camera. And this should shift them to face the camera as you pan around. But you see, as I did that, nothing seems to be changing. It might have something to do with the fix clone being ticked. If I undo that, you'll see that it now faces the camera, but it's backwards. So I have to change something else here. If I go to the two text layers, in the coordinates, I might change the X size here to -1, which will flip it. And when I do that, now you see this is facing the camera. There was other times when, you know, even doing this didn't really produce the desired result. I don't know whether I was just doing things wrong, but it seems in this case, it actually just worked correctly the first time. Okay, so that's how you do that. You still won't be able to really preview the numbers in the scene. This setup is quite extensive on your CPU and calculates on each frame. So again, this is something you should probably do at the end when everything else is finished. You could go to the text splines though and try and speed them up by, and again, if I just solo, I will lower the number of segments on my text spline. So if I go to the object settings, the intermediate points, I could put the angle up from 5 degrees to something a bit higher. Let's say 90 degrees, and as I do that, you can see the 9 loses some of its segments. So obviously if you got too close to these numbers, you would see that problem. So maybe don't go so high, and from a distance, I think about 40 will work in my case, and this will just reduce the number of polygons, which may slightly improve the responsiveness of the scene, but really in this case it's still quite laggy. Anyway, moving on. Okay, in the next section we're gonna look at how to export this in a way that gives you a lot of control when you do the compositing in After Effects. I'm gonna switch to an older version of the scene where I was naming my layers a bit better, just so I can speed things up a bit. Okay, so this next section could be a bit tricky if you haven't used Cinema 4D's take system before, but I will do my best to try and explain this. So the goal is to render each of the elements in our scene to a separate folder. And this is a previous version of this project before I finalized the current style we are looking at here. And you can see these various folders labeled after each of the elements in the scene. So, you know, the base, the buildings, the various floors, markers, and so on and so on. Inside of each of these, you have an image sequence. And the idea is to bring this all back together in After Effects and still be able to control certain aspects of each element, like the color, brightness, and so on. Okay, so let me show you how this would work in Cinema 4D. This is where we are right now. I will right-click and go to the Take Manager. This will open up like this. It might be docked in your layout if you haven't changed your default layout in Cinema, but you can just undock it. And here we are. And just in case people don't know how to do this, if it's docked over here, just right-click and undock. All right. So I was playing with this before, and you can see my first take is called main buildings, and that's what it's for. It's for the main buildings in my scene. Okay, and by the way, I think this feature was introduced in version 16 of Cinema, but it could be 17. I'm not entirely sure. So I will have mentioned this at the beginning of the video anyway, so you won't get to this stage and think, you know, what do I do now? All right. So the main buildings take, this is there by default. I just renamed it to say that. And on this level, we want to leave only the buildings enabled in our scene. So if I just go to the other elements, I am just turning these off. Hold AOT and double click, and I am only leaving the buildings and their outlines. So if I do a quick preview, this is what we are left with. And so now I can create a new take. Let's just go to File, New Take, and this will be a child of the take above it. All right, so as this is right now, this is just inheriting everything from the first take that we have here. So we want to override what we are seeing in this particular take. And I find the easiest way in this particular case is to enable the automatic keyframing. Now you could also do this manually, and it might be worth researching this take system and finding out a bit more in detail how it works. But you can go to, let's say, the buildings. We want to turn these off in this take and switch on the next thing. So if I go to the buildings layer, in the basic tab, we have the visible in editor and visible in renderer options. And I want to override these here. So I can just simply right click and override. And now you can see I'm able to change the values. Again, before I click the override switch, everything is grayed out and I can't change anything. So if I do this and now turn this off, you see the buildings have disappeared. And the thing I want to bring back, or the next element, I would enable that using the same type of method. You know, go to the thing I want to turn on again, go to the basic tab and override this control in this particular take. Now, that's the manual way to do this, and most of the attributes or clickable things can be overwritten in each take, and that's what's so great about this. But an easier way could be to just use the auto take mode. You just have to be careful you're not making a bunch of changes because it will record everything you do in this take and then you know, save it to that take, and then you know, you would then move on to the next one. So if I enable this, you see now everything is blue in my interface. This means that automatic override is enabled. So now I can go to floor number 1 and bring that back, and we see just our lights in this case, and there we go. I just want this layer on its own in this particular take. So just a quick refresh of what's happened here. In the main buildings take, which was our first one, we have just the main buildings, and then I went and created a new subtake, and in this we started by manually turning off the buildings using the override, and then I used the auto method to bring back the floor. Either way, we're basically doing the same thing. It just depends whether you want to do it by hand or let Cinema 4D record all the changes for you. Okay, I'm just trying to explain this clearly so that no one is confused. Okay, so we can call this one floor number 1. And if I create another take, and you can still see I have the automatic keyframing enabled, whatever takes you create here, it will always be inheriting the first take, the main one up here. So in this case, you know, this is just with the buildings. So again, we have the same thing going on here. So I just need to turn off the buildings, and let's enable floor number 2, and that has now been saved. This is the grid layer. So if I call this floor 2 and cycle through, you can see each take is displaying a different object based on what I am turning on and off. So I'm going to continue on like this. This is going to be floor number 3, and in this one again, it's inheriting the top layer. We can, you know, we could have maybe inherited the one above. So if I make that a child of that layer, it now inherits only the one above it. So this time I could just turn off floor number 2 and enable number 3. So you can do this at various levels depending on what kind of workflow you want. So this is that color we have on the floor. Moving on, I think the next element I want to bring back is the markers. I guess we're just going in order of the objects in the scene here. So let's create another new take, and depending on where this is in the hierarchy, you know, it will either copy the initial buildings again, and you get the idea. So still with the automatic override turned on, let's just go through the same motions and turn off our buildings and enable the markers. So we now have this layer, and hopefully as I do this more and more, this is starting to become more obvious to you. I am a Cinema 4D user, of course. I've been using it for years, and you know, it didn't take me straight away to learn how to use the take system. I had to just play with it, and eventually I started to understand how to use it properly. So you will have to do the same too. Okay, this is the take for the waypoint. I will just disable the buildings again and enable the waypoint. And these are our waypoint markers. And let's see if we create another take. We will shut that off again, and let's enable what's this, the numbers. Okay, and we also need to just enable that. So this is the numbers, and we can create let's see here, another take. I think that could be it. Oh, actually no, this is the last reflective floor layer. And on this one, actually, I want a bunch of the things in the scene to show up in the reflection. So the buildings need to be in that reflection, and currently they are, as you can see, but I don't want to see the buildings because we already have that in the first layer. So we can, instead of turning off the buildings, I will go to the compositing tag, and in this take the buildings will not be seen by the camera, but you know, the reflection will still be there. So that's the buildings. We need to do the same for the outline. And there we go. I also want, let's say, the waypoints to be reflected on the floor. So I will bring them back in this take. And all of these operations I am doing are being automatically overridden because I still have this switch over here turned on. So I just find this is the fastest way to do this, as long as you're aware of what you're doing. And you know, the UI is blue, so you definitely know something is different as you are doing this. So that should help you out. So, you know, untick seen by a camera in all of these compositing tags, which are on the waypoints, but they will be on the reflection. And that's what I want for this reflection layer, or which is like floor number 4, I suppose. Let's call this floor reflection. Okay, so just to you know, go back through and check everything's working. This is a good idea. Just go through and make sure that each of your takes contain the correct thing as you labeled it before. And you can see I have a slightly different setup here with, you know, making this a child of the one above, just to show you how the hierarchy works. But visually it's the same thing. This could have been underneath the main buildings. I just needed to turn them off again. But you get the idea. Now you might be thinking, how then do we render this to appear in a separate folder each, like this? And you do this in your output settings, in your save path. In the save path, we want to use what's called a token. And this is indicated by a $ followed by the word take in this particular example. And what this allowed me to do was to save out each of these takes into a separate folder. So you can see the main folder is called takes, and up to this point, this is just a regular save path, but this would only save the main take. And then I put forward bracket $take and then $take again. And what this did was, each time you create a /, this creates a new folder. So, you know, if you follow any folder structure, that's how these are separated. So at the first token here, this created a folder, and then the last bit, it named each sequence based on its take. And if we go back to our folders here, you see that's the same structure we have. So in the base layer, for example, or the buildings layer, we have the buildings folder. That's the first part of the token here. And then each of these frames is called buildings, followed by a number. So this is Cinema 4D's token system. If you want to read up a bit more about this, right click anywhere and show help to bring up the manual, and go to the search tab and just search for token. And you'll be able to read up about this and find out a bit more precisely how this works. And this is actually really useful, especially if you've never used this feature in Cinema. So you can see there are other types of tokens, such as the project name, what camera is currently enabled. So you can have the same scene, but render it you know, different times, and be able to separate each of the renders into different folders or names based on these various attributes here. And in this case, we used the take name to put each render into a separate folder. Okay, so there's a lot to kind of take in there, but you get the idea. If I structure my output like this, I will I'll be able to output all of these as separate layers. And It's the same thing for the multi-pass images. You can use this token in any save dialog. And it's the same for the multi-pass image. Anyway, that's all well and good. Now you know how to output the different takes. You can render everything to the picture viewer, so render all takes to the picture viewer, or you can use the render queue. And actually what I would do here, let me copy this take here because I did this before. Let's call this take 2, just to use as an example. So I will save this here, and this will be my 2 tokens at the end. And I will just disable multi-pass image for now, but if I wanted to, I could actually enable it. In fact, I would just do that. Take 2 multi. So if each take has different multi-pass layers enabled, you know, it will name them accordingly for you and save each one to the appropriate folder. So I will just do this twice. So we have a folder and then also the name. And that just helps to organize everything. If I go to my output settings and let's do just a single frame, and I can render all takes to the picture viewer. And what you will see here is it would just go through them one by one. And let me show you where this is going in my particular save path. We have our render folder take 2. You can see we already have floor number 1 and floor number 2, and you can see these folders being created automatically as we go through this. And if we go back to cinema, you can see it's just going through the different takes and outputting each frame just like that. So this works great. You could also use the render queue. If I go to render and render queue, you can see I was doing this before. I would simply just file and add project with all takes. And yes, just save before we output. And it will list the project, and you can see the take section here loads each of the takes we created back inside of the project, and you would just start rendering. And this will just go through one by one, just like before, and output and create new folders for us. And here is something else you can do, by the way. You can assign a different render setting to a different take. And let me show you an example of how I had to do this for this project. I wanted to be able to control the outline of my buildings separately in After Effects, but I couldn't just output this as a separate take, because if I turn off the buildings, for example, let's say we were to set this up as a separate take, it would look like this. Now, there are places where, you know, if I were to then take this and overlay this onto just the buildings layer as 2 separate layers in After Effects, the outline layer would be completely in front of the buildings. So you wouldn't get areas where, you know, the outline goes behind. So that look would just not be the same. So that's why these 2 layers are on the same take currently. But I can use another method to be able to control the outline in After Effects, and that's to use an object buffer. So on the outlines, I already have a compositing tag on here, and in the object buffer tab, I have enabled buffer number 2, just like this. So this will be on the main take, but all the other takes, I need the same render settings without a buffer enabled. So let me show you how this would work. If I go to my render settings, you can see this is the main setting with the buffer enabled. Let's just drop down and call this one no buffer, okay? And switch off the buffer and switch off multi-pass on this particular layer, because if I were to just leave the main take with the buffer enabled, on all these other takes where we don't have the outlines enabled, the renderer would still output a blank object buffer. So we would be wasting a lot of hard drive space for no reason. So that's why if I now go to my takes, I can click the render icon over here, and by default they just inherit the parent. So we want to go in here and change them to no buffer. The only one which is going to render the buffer is the first level here, which is just the main default render that we set at the beginning. Okay, so now if I were to render this out, I would have my object buffer as well, and that will allow me to control the outlines in After Effects separately. Aside from all of that, you also want to make sure that each of your different render settings have alpha enabled, and also in your anti-aliasing settings, you can either use the same settings for all of the render settings, or you could actually, you know, for when you think you don't need extra anti-aliasing, you could lower this for some of the takes. But in my scene, I just set everything to best 1:1 4:4 and a threshold of 10%, and this still rendered quite quickly with decent quality. Anyway, that's it. Let's jump into After Effects and see how to composite the scene. This is the folder with the different image sequences for each different take. So I can just take this and drop it into After Effects. And there's a lot being loaded here, so it might freeze up for a few seconds, but just give it some time to think. And here we go. I would just put everything into a folder here, so it's not too confusing what we are dealing with. And in this new folder, I can start by interpreting my footage, because this is currently 30 FPS. In cinema, I think I was using 24. So let's do that. And I can remember these settings and apply it to the rest of the other layers. So interpret and apply. Okay. Take the first layer and let's just drag this to a new composition. Things may appear differently as they did in Cinema 4D. That's because this is a different color profile to what we were working with back in C4D. So I need to go to the project working space, and let's start by going up to 16 bits. And I'm going to change the working space to Adobe RGB. And also linearize the working space and click OK, and this looks a bit closer to what I had in Cinema 4D. And from this point, we just want to get our layers and try to construct something like this here. Now, these are the older layers I was rendering before I recorded the tutorial, so the naming here is a bit different to what we just created in Cinema. But the idea is the same. We can take the various floor layers, put these below the buildings. So that's the reflective floor. Let's see what else we have here. This is an older effect I was doing, but I decided to ditch. I originally did the grid in Cinema, but we will do that in After Effects instead, because it's just a bit easier to work with. So the only other floor we need here is the dotted pattern. Okay, and then we have the markers. They can be above the buildings, and the numbers and the waypoint effect. And this is where you'll start to see the real advantage of separating your layers, because if any element is appearing too strong, or you just want to dial it back, you can adjust it on its own. So the main buildings, I would drop the opacity to about 60 perhaps, and everything else will still the same. And this is where the buffer might come in useful, because by fading the buildings, it fades the outlines too. But if you remember, I created a separate pass which outputted an alpha of just the outlines, so I can import that And there is something else I did separately another time, which was the object buffer of just the buildings. And for this buffer, I actually had to create an extra take and overrode the transparency and alpha channel by turning them off. So I would have a fully opaque object buffer like this here. So, you know, that's something I did sort of off screen. But it was just another separate take, so it wasn't that difficult. I will apply the same interpretation settings, and let's bring the first buffer, which is the outlines, into the scene, and I will set the blending mode to screen, and you can see how this looks now. So this is the kind of control I was aiming to get. I will go to color correction and tint, and we can change the white to the same kind of blue color, so around about 185 for the hue. And we can even apply some glow to this, so stylize and glow, and that might just light up the edges a bit for us. So as you stack everything together, you'll start to see how, you know, rendering your layer separately can be really useful. The numbers here are white. I want them to be more of an orange color. So color correction and tint again, and just change this to anything we want. So about 17 for the hue. You may find in linear workflow or a linear workspace, the histogram and colors here will look a bit different. So you might have to adjust slightly to what you are used to. But I'm also going to put some more glow on the numbers, just a small amount, and let's lower the threshold so we get more of the original color, and maybe drop the strength to about 0.2, nothing too strong. I think the original floor might be too reflective, so let's create a black solid to put below everything. And I will go to the floor and let's just lower the opacity here quite drastically, maybe about 10. And we could even do the same for the grid floor, so maybe put that to about 60 or so. And again, in linear workflow, this might behave a bit different to what you are used to. And the reason I outputted a different object buffer for the buildings where it was more opaque is because I don't necessarily want the markers here to appear above the buildings. And right now they are, because the buildings are a bit transparent. So we can take the opaque object buffer, put this above the waypoint markers, and I would use the opaque buffer as a luma inverted matte, because we want the opposite of where the buffer is. Okay, so now it won't be cutting through the buildings. If I still want this to be slightly see-through, but just not as strong, I can go to the buffer above and lower the opacity, so maybe something like 60, and we'll start to see through that a bit slightly, but not too much. So you can just use these and see if you can blend everything a bit better. Let's see what else I could do here. Of course, we have the orange grid. I originally did this in Cinema, but I realized it was much easier to use After Effects. But it meant I needed to use the Cinema 4D project file. But that's easy. I can just take my Cinema 4D file here, and with Cineware this will import into After Effects quite easily. Let's put this below everything and extract the data from the scene, and we will have the camera here now. Okay, so switch off the C4D file so it doesn't slow us down, and I'm going to create a new solid. Let's make this 3000 by 3000. So just super large. That's 300 there, not 3000. And I'm going to apply a grid effect to this. So effect, generate, and grid. and I will set the size from to be a width slider, and let's just set this to, I think it should be 300, I'm not sure, but the border size should be just 1 pixel. Let's turn this into a 3D layer, and it's going to be in the center of the scene, so zero out the positioning, and I will also change the orientation on X to 90 degrees. And we need to scale this up. Let's go for 200%. Okay, so basically what I did in Cinema 4D, it took me several minutes to configure. In After Effects, it's much faster and a lot cleaner looking actually. Anyway, this needs to be below everything, so I think below the buildings, and I will set the color to be a kind of deep orange. And then I'll also use the same buffer which I used for the markers. So if I just grab this again from over here, put this above the grid lines, and set the luma matte again to be luma inverted. Okay, and again, I just want to see through slightly, so maybe drop the opacity of the matte to about 80 or so you can still see through in some areas. And on the grid lines, I will put some glow effects, so stylize and glow. And I don't think I will change much here. That looks pretty good as it is. The waypoints and markers also need a glow effect on them, so just go ahead and do that. We can perhaps lower the intensity, maybe 0.4, so it's not too strong. And I might bump up the radius perhaps, and maybe even increase the threshold. I think that's too strong. Let's go for 0.2. I don't want to overdo this because it might make it look worse. I'll copy this glow effect and put this onto the markers layer, and again just very subtle and not too strong. Next step, I'm gonna do the blur effect you see here. I started by creating a custom depth map. I could have outputted a depth path from Cinema that would have probably been a bit better looking, but I think this will be still pretty good. I can create a new solid, and let's make this comp size 1920 by 1080. Open this up and put this into a separate composition. So right click pre-comp, and then make another solid, but just make this one white. Okay. On the white one, I will add a rectangle mask, so just double click. And what I will do here is make it wider so it goes beyond the left and right edges. And then I'm just going to feather this in, so I think around 200. Double click again to scale and just bring this in to about there or so. If I go back to my main comp, let's put this below everything, and this should be named the depth of field composition. And I will get an adjustment layer, go to effect and blur and sharpen, and we want the camera lens blur effect. And under layer, let's load up our depth of field composition we have just created, and this is doing the opposite of what I want, so I will just invert the blur map. And I will also bump up the strength to about 11 or so. And that's how I blur out the foreground and kind of focus on the center part of the map. And I think we might lose some highlights around the edges. So let's go to the highlight gain and set this up to the highest, which is 100. And it just makes sure that whatever gets blurred out doesn't get a bit faint. You can still see the highlights. Okay, and we're getting close to the end here. The last thing is just some maybe extra glow effects and color grading. So let me do all of this on one layer. I will go to Effect, Stylize, and Glow, and just increase the radius, let's say about 200. kind of a haze effect over everything. We could maybe lower the threshold and the intensity to 0.1. It's a very sensitive control, it seems, maybe even lower than that, 0.05. And then I'll go to color correction and let's get a levels adjustment. And I want to dial in some blue and green into the shadows. So if I start with blue and just moving the output black here, but you don't want to move it too much, so maybe something like 200, maybe 400, so it's a bit stronger. And I will go for green and only 200, and this will give me some toning in my shadows. Now I could go a bit extra here and get a curves adjustment and just bump the contrast up and maybe fade slightly. And again, in linear workflow, everything will behave very differently to what you might normally expect. But something like this, probably too faded, but I think just as an example, it's fine. One final thing I will add is a chromatic aberration effect. Now, if you have magic bullet looks, this is very easy. Just go to edit, and it's one of the lens effects you can apply. So if I go to tools, chromatic aberration, I will go for green and magenta set to 1 and blue and yellow set to 2. And it's that simple. Now, if you don't have this effect, you can do this manually. It just means you have to pre-compose everything first. And in this first pre-comp, let's go to Effect, Channel, and Set Channel. And then we want to isolate each color to a different layer. So on the first one, we will leave red from red, but green and blue should be turned off. So let's go ahead and do that. And then let's make a copy. In the second one, you turn off red and turn on green, and you get the idea. So in the last one, we turn off red and green, but turn on blue. And then if we blend the layers back together just by adding, we can now go to the scale and offset them slightly to get the RGB split effect. So on the first one, we can go for 100.5, and on the second one, we can go for 101, and this will create a chromatic aberration effect. Maybe it's not too obvious here. We could go for 101 and 102, and that's going to exaggerate it a bit more, but you get the idea. You can do this manually without a plugin. Okay, but that would be it. That was my process for compositing this. It doesn't quite look like what I have here, but it's quite similar. So I hope you learned some new stuff by watching this tutorial, and I hope you enjoyed watching. That is how you create a holographic digital map using Cinema 4D and After Effects. Thanks for watching, and I will see you next time. And as promised, here is a quick tutorial on how to export Google Sketchup models so you can open them in Cinema 4D. And here we have a small example. In the Pro version of SketchUp, which you can try for free for 30 days, you can go to File, Export, and 3D Model. And you want to save as an FBX file format. So I'm just going to throw this to my desktop. And then I can drag this into Cinema 4D or go to File, Merge Objects, and then just find where I saved the file to. And we can just click OK. We don't need to change anything here. And what I like to do is to just clear all of the materials. And if I go to Display with Lines, you can see where the different edges are. So I like to always get rid of the floor if there is anything extra there. And then I can take the single mesh and just delete all of the tags which are on this. And this is just part of the cleanup that you may have to do. Anyway, you can see the angle is a bit off, so I can go into the top view and just rotate this until it is at a right angle. So something like this here. And one of the buildings has some triangular polygons, so we have to go to edge mode and try and get rid of some of these. But before we do, let's just make sure that the mesh is optimized. So if I Control and A, right click, optimize with a tolerance of 0.1, let's just make sure that any unused points will be cleared. And now I should be able to select some of these edges and just dissolve them away. So if I right click here and dissolve, it can get rid of the triangular polygons, and then I'm just left with the good polygons which I want to keep. Okay, so that's just a basic way to clean up some of these models. You may have to do a bit more in some cases and less in others, but that's it. Just a quick lesson on how to import models from Google Sketchup into Cinema 4D. And if I go to axis mode and enable this, I can reset the rotation so that this is always going to be facing the correct way. And you might want to do this several times and collect different blocks. Anyway, that's it. Thanks for watching.